Hey everybody, welcome back to the floating steampunk island nation of Volvara. Today's episode is kind of split into two separate parts, sort of, not that much, but I'm beginning with a bunch of random bits and bops alongside the island, pretty much like I've been doing all this time, just adding a bit of scenery here and there. Then halfway through the video there's a bit of a section on a dark ride part of the ride. It's quite an extensive section actually. Mostly because of some lighting changes that I'll go into in a minute. And the very last part of this video, and really what I wanted to name this video after because it's actually been one of my favorite things from this episode, and definitely one of my favorite things to work on, is the big golden domes, which are replacing some of the older domes and spires that I did have in place, but that were made using older pieces and that I think at this point look kind of outdated. And so I'm just dragging in the new pieces, mostly from the adventure update, to try and give the whole island a bit of a slightly updated look, add some extra colors in there, make everything look a little bit less drab, because I think, you know, even though it's steampunk, all of the textures at the moment are very greyish, very dark, and there's not much shiny going on, and now that we have those new adventure pieces, with those supposedly gold pieces, I think there's a bunch of stuff in there that we can actually use to create a brassy look for some of the elements of the castle. So yeah, we'll go into that at a later stage. Right now though, I thought that I wanted to get some more foliage onto this island, and this has always been one of those things that for me felt like a really difficult decision to make, because it's a steampunk theme and it's a really industrial theme, and I'm trying to make the island as gritty and as detailed as possible. But I really felt like it would look a little bit better with just a tad of foliage. Not too much, but just a few trees here and there. So literally what I did is I just plopped a bunch of trees in the air wherever I felt like it would look good to have a tree. And then afterwards I basically worried at a later stage how I could actually realistically connect these trees to the island and sort of give them a planter to stand in. So structurally, they really don't make much sense at all. I just wanted to figure out what places would look slightly better with a tree and just kind of get that as a limitation to work around and come up with some creative solutions to basically have floating trees, more or less, in certain places. So there's this big wide open space in the middle of the ride where lots of tracks are crossing over each other, and there's lots of bridges and pipes, and I just put a tree up in there because it was a bit too gritty and industrial with a lack of colors that I felt like some greenery would fit right in there. And then there's a few trees alongside the outskirts of the island where I felt it would be nice to have some things poking out, and having a tree somewhere would be a pretty good reason to build like one of these, basically these kinds of balcony-ish sections. And yeah, they definitely don't make much sense. But then again, this is a flying castle, and what really makes sense in Volvara? I just thought it would be a neat idea to add some foliage into the castle, and I can see why for some people maybe this might seem like something that goes more or less against the theme, and the island might look a little bit better without all of this foliage. But in my opinion, I think it looks just a bit better by adding this foliage to it. Without it, it's just a lot of the same colors. And I didn't want to adjust the color scheme too much because I didn't want everything to be all of these industrial, gritty, brownish colors, but at the same time I did want to add a bit more vibrant look to this island, and I think adding foliage is probably the best way to go around doing that. There's also some slightly minor ways of adding some foliage here and there as well. Obviously lots of planters and small window boxes with those flowers, so there's lots of that smaller stuff as well. But yeah, that's mostly what I'm starting off this episode with, and if there's anything that I could say about foliage regarding that, it is definitely kind of recognizable in a sense that I do often spend a lot of time just moving a few trees around. Honestly, when you're looking at a very large facade, or your weenie perhaps, or a main street, or some major site, I think tree placement is like one of those very minute details that I always end up spending a lot of time just to kind of figure out where exactly I want to see the tree, where exactly I want it to be placed, what kind of tree I'm looking for. And honestly, sometimes I spend more time placing just a few trees around a really important building in a way that adds to the building rather than blocks the view of it, than I would spend building an entire forest. Just because for me it's always so important to like get the placement exactly right. And honestly, I'm just a fan of seeing some well-placed foliage. I think in some places it can be very good if you just spend a lot of time thinking very critically about where you want to put your tree. That was one of the most ridiculous sentences I've ever said on video, but I'm pretty serious with this. It just kind of depends on how much of an impact the tree is gonna have. If it's in the middle of a street or around a weenie or something like that, I think it's quite important. But if it's further away, if it's with less detail, or if it's just in a forest, in that case, I don't think you should be too concerned about your trees and just pretty much plop them down wherever as quickly as possible. Just kind of depends on the context, I suppose. In any case, that is everything about foliage on this floating castle. For now, I wanted to get into the lighting and actually discuss what I said I would discuss at the beginning of this video. Because there's been a lighting change in recent Planet Coaster updates, and honestly, I don't actually even remember which update it was, whether it was the Adventure update or the Studios Pack update. So, I honestly didn't ever notice this before. I guess it's just because I don't have a ride that interacts with terraforming the way that this one does. Plus, I just haven't played Planet Coaster that much recently. But I just looked at Volvara recently and found out that it's a lot darker inside than it used to be. So, before I started this time lapse, I just did a bunch of off-ride or off-screen stuff where I tried placing as much terraforming as I could inside the castle walls without being visible, because now with the new lighting, terraforming really blocks the light, even if it's just a very narrow layer of ground. In the past that wouldn't really block the light too much and it would still kind of shine through, but nowadays it pretty much makes it almost pitch black underneath it. And while there's been some criticisms against this, I know that a lot of people have been complaining that it's too dark in caves or underneath rock formations. In the case of Volvara, it's actually pretty much perfect, because I've always wanted the inside part of this castle to be as dark as I could, to really feel like a dark ride section. It was just always kind of impossible, because this castle is so compact, there's barely any space for terraforming to create this kind of light. But with the new lighting system, I can basically hide a very narrow layer of terraforming inside the dome, alongside the edges of the dome, in some of these walls as well, so that it's pretty much dark inside of here, even though the walls are pretty thin. So I'm actually really glad with that change. I think for one, it makes the ride a little bit more interesting, because you're sort of flying in and out of the light. You've got those outside sections where obviously it's really bright and you've got all the foliage and stuff, but you keep flying through the building itself as well, so lots of interesting contrast there. And I also think it just looks a little bit better if you're looking at the castle from an outside perspective as well. Like, you can see some of the entrances that the coaster track is going into the building with, and you can really see it going through a dark tunnel. You can really see it entering pitch black, whereas in the past, the insides of buildings just kind of looked like shadowy. The whole thing would just have the color of a shadow, but it would never actually be dark. And the fact that it's really actually dark now is pretty awesome, at least for this project. So yeah, I'm really glad with how dark this new lighting is, and kind of hoping that things are gonna stay this way, but we'll see about that in any case. For now, I've decided to work on the dark ride section and provide some lighting over here. I'm not going to finish it yet. I'm actually gonna dedicate the next episode to that, because there's still some other things that I wanted to do over here. But at least the foundation is pretty much here. Also decided to do a little bit of work on the station itself. And I suppose this is where you can see some of the limitations coming in of this new lighting change. Because the way that it works is that walls still don't block light, they only cast shadows. So with walls alone you're not going to achieve this effect. It's only terraforming, and it's only underneath the terraforming that you're going to get this dark color. So if the entrances into the building were really large, the like difference in light would feel really unnatural. You would just kind of have like one place would be completely dark, and then right next to it would be completely light, and it wouldn't really make sense if you look at it from the outside. So I tried making the entrances into the building as narrow as possible, so that the entrances look like they're really blocking off all the lights, and then that's the reason that all of a sudden it gets really dark really quickly as you're entering the building and leaving the building. So yeah, that just kind of helps sell the illusion a little bit better that all the walls are actually what is making it so dark inside, even though it's really the terraforming. So yeah, that's a little bit of that dark ride stuff, but we'll get back to that later in the future. For now, I think I just didn't have my fix of spires in too long, because I just couldn't stop myself from stopping whenever I was working on some spires. Now, I'm gonna attempt a spire which I've never tried before, and it's a little bit of an annoying spire to do. It's a combination between that spiral spire that I had earlier in the series, in the first episode actually, and a onion spire. So it's a bit of an annoying shape to work with, but it's surprisingly easy to make. It just went through a couple of different iterations of it, until at some point I decided that just making it a simple spire with a simple spiral pattern would be enough. But at this point I was still kind of musing the idea of having two spires within one spire, I guess. Like that old meme where it's like, hey, I see you liked spires, so I put a spire in your spire so you can get inspired or something. I don't know. Anyway, that idea was ditched eventually because that just kind of looked ridiculous. Even though I do kind of dig the look of it, I don't think it quite fits with the rest of the castle. So yeah, it had a bit of a strange look. So eventually I ditched that idea and did something else. For a while I was also thinking, you know what, I could try that wood again, but then I realized that we should totally get some brass colors in here, and the brass actually looks pretty damn good if you get some right colors. So at this point I just got the scenery items which you're supposed to build like fountains and statues with, but which actually work really well for doing these kinds of it's almost art piece sculptures, but then with the gold texture. I got a couple of questions already on how I did this spire. Well, this is basically how, just a variety of supposed statue pieces, I believe these should be, just kind of laid down as if they were these separate bricks of like brass roof tiles that are all put together to form this spiral roof. Also importantly, the wooden frame of the roof is on a different building than the actual brass is, just to make things a little bit easier to like change the colors later on or change the design ever so slightly. I think sometimes if you're doing complicated spires like this, it can really help to separate your framework from whatever you're using to make the roof itself. Just so that if you want to recolor stuff or that kind of thing later on, you can do so just by hovering over the entire thing instead of having to select every single piece separately, which would take way too long. So yeah, that's one spire down and a few more to go. I believe, if I remember correctly, that's 3 more to go. So there was this spire which still had an in-game roof piece, and you know me, I don't mess with in-game pieces. That had to be gone at some point. So it's finally time to get rid of that thing, replace it with a I would always say slightly better custom version. I don't know if it's slightly better, but at least it's different, and that's what I was going for. And at least it has a brassy texture. That looks pretty neat. So this is just a simple spire, quote unquote, that just has a very similar shape to what the in-game roof has, just with a different texture. Just because I liked the way that the tower looked previously, I just wasn't really digging the simple roof texture and the fact that it looks like every single roof ever. So I just made that quick section, then rotated it as you normally do. Actually made a mistake with the rotation. I rotated it a little bit too much, and then I realized that it actually looks like brass roof tiles now. So that was a bit of an accident, and I decided to actually keep that in because it actually looks pretty damn awesome. It gives a lot of detail to that spire and makes for a really interesting texture. I guess the only downside is it uses a lot of pieces, but honestly, this island is already on so many pieces that I really can't be bothered too much about that sort of thing. So moving on, we've already been at the dome for a while. I didn't want to replace the entire dome, that would have been really annoying to do, and also I think that would be better to be red. I still want red to be the main color of the roofs, and gold to be more of, or brass color to be more of an accent color, so it's used on a few towers. It's used on some parts of the castle, but it's more of an accent than roof. There's this sort of very basic rule of thumb, and I'm already starting on a new tower, don't worry, I'll get to that at some point. But there's this sort of basic rule of thumb in Main Street buildings, but I think it can count for a lot of buildings if you want to play it safe, to just choose 3 different colors. Choose one color for your roof, choose one color for your walls, and choose a color for your accents. And the accents could be a small cupola on the roof, it could be the windows, it could be a small cover over the front door, just any small parts. The wall colors just have to be one certain color with maybe some slight variation, and then you choose your roof color. And there's a bit of an idea of that in the entire island as well. The general wall color is that beige brick-ish texture. The sort of default roof color is red, and then for the accents there is gold and some green here and there as well, because I did want to have slightly more variation than just choosing warm colors everywhere. So yeah, I finished that other spire, and now it is time for a very fun little project as soon as I'm done with just the finishing touches of this little guy here, where I wanted to try and make a very small pavilion, but apparently I'm still spending a lot of time trying to figure this thing out. In the end, that's not too interesting anyway. Yeah, let's get to the pavilion, come on. There we go. So this is a place where I always wondered what I could do with it, because looking at the castle I always felt like there was a tower missing over here, but it wouldn't really make sense to have a tower at this base, because there's sort of this outdoor plaza that's coming out of the taller parts of the building, and I definitely wanted to keep the entire roof here flat and not build like crazy spires or something. And I figured I might as well just build a pavilion on this place, which isn't so much part of the building architecturally, but just kind of plopped on top of it. And I thought that would be a pretty interesting way to get around it. Also means that there's a little bit of variety, like it's not just towers, there's a few domes as well, and then you've got this neat little pavilion. And honestly, I don't think I've ever tried my hand at a Victorian-esque pavilion in this game before, and I'm a huge fan of those things. I think they look really cool with those narrow pillars, all of that detailing, and like these roofs which really stick out from the pillars as well. Just in general, they're pretty awesome. Stuff like that little pavilion in Disney Main Street, that's the sort of thing that this was inspired by. So working on the pavilion foundation itself is not too difficult. You're just gonna put a post in the middle and then kind of work your way around that. My general rule of thumb is whenever you're building outward from that post, just make sure that the end of that is parallel with the post if you're looking at the post from straight ahead. So you can see me looking at the post a few times just to make sure that this little triangular thing that I'm building outside the post is actually going to line up correctly when I copy this all over with that whole circular method of making spires. So that means that you can save a whole lot of time. You just make one small triangular part of the pavilion and it should hook up correctly. Sorry, I was out of it for a second, my sister just came home. But yeah, that is really basically the general strategy for this little pavilion here. One thing that sort of separates it from what it's inspired by is that usually these pavilions tend to have more of a flat roof, I suppose. Something like a dome-like roof, or a roof that does point upward at the start but sort of turns into a dome at the top. And this one is really much more like a spire. It's much more vertical. It goes up quite some height. I think actually it's taller than the lower floors of this thing, including the spire. So it's a pretty tall little thing. But that's just kind of what I wanted to do with this thing. I felt like there was a spire-like shape missing in the middle of the castle, and hopefully this is a good way to add that kind of thing without having to add another tower. It's also interesting how now I'm using completely different things to finish off the spires, like these new adventure pieces. I think you can kind of tell through the way that I'm making these spires that the game has changed a lot over the years, especially because I've been making this park for more than a year already, so you can definitely see these differences within this park already. Anyway, don't play drinking games with the word spire in this episode. That's it. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next episode.